June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. The nightlight stitched a necklace of electric white through the town, as if someone had drawn the coastline of a continent with a bright pen. The pencil trembled in Hans Muller's hand as he scrawled into a tiny journal he kept hidden beneath his shirt, the graphite line shaking as his breath fogged the paper. He had been trained to accept shortage as proof of moral superiority and to believe that abundance belonged only to corrupt nations. Yet outside his car window, there were shops with glass that gleamed, street lamps that hummed, and people moving with a measured assurance he had never seen. It was not a rumor, nor a clever image designed to seduce. It was a fact laid out in light, in warm bread carried in brown paper, and the precise click of a factory gate closing at midnight. In a matter of hours, men who had eaten rationed soup behind barbed wire would sit on padded Pullman seats and be offered coffee and buttered rolls. This episode will trace how food, water, light, trains, factories, and hospitals did not merely comfort prisoners. They undermined an entire set of certainties. With journals, letters, and official reports, we will watch belief erode under the steady weight of production. How could a single running tap and a Liberty ship leave so many men questioning everything they had been taught to love and fear? What follows is a document based on archives, interviews, and diaries that seeks to explain that transformation from the inside. The backdrop of surrender began months before that Texas night. In the summer of 1943, German units in North Africa and Southern Europe had collapsed into a mixture of pragmatic withdrawal and bureaucratic chaos. Field commanders sent reports of depleted supplies, of fuel and ammunition, of collapsed rail links, and of men whose uniforms were threadbare. After localized pockets of fierce resistance, many thousands were collected and processed in coastal holding areas. Lieutenant James Carter wrote in a report from Iran that the prisoners arrived bewildered, distrustful, and exhausted. The military narrative at the time focused on logistics rather than revelation. It noted numbers and categories and the need to move tens of thousands across oceans. The American command treated prisoners as a problem to be managed, with food, shelter, and work assignments. For the men themselves, the moment of capture was not simply defeat. It was the rupture of a world they had accepted without question. Carl Becker remembered the moment his unit surrendered at dusk, with the air smelling of diesel and dust. He wrote in a letter later that the first thing he noticed was not the cages nor the guards, but the orderly process of counting the men, issuing blankets, and checking teeth. This mundane efficiency suggested a civilization whose priorities were different from the rhetoric he had been fed. The shock of that contrast planted the first seeds of doubt. Processing began near fields of salt and scrub, where trucks and small tents provided the first contact with American systems. The tents smelled of disinfectant and canned coffee. Men queued for identification, for inoculation, and for first assessment of health and strength. Dialogues in those lines were tense, curious, and sometimes mocking. A medic named Samuel Price would pat the shoulder of a prisoner and offer a cigarette and an extra ration if the man agreed to a shot. The procedure was methodical. Identifications were logged, names anglicized where necessary, and teeth checked for cavities. The act of vaccination itself was simple yet intimate, a cold needle, a human hand, and a momentary flash of fear. The first meals consisted of canned stew, crackers, and hot coffee served in enamel mugs that steamed like small lamps in the hand. As prisoners ate, many compared the portions to the messages they had heard about American privation. One German wrote that the coffee tasted like a betrayal. In this scene, a sequence of exchanges unfolded between a processing sergeant and a group of prisoners that revealed more than numbers. "Where are we being sent?" asked a man with a scarf bunched at his neck. "To camps inland," the sergeant replied and adjusted his cap. "Why so far?" another asked, and the sergeant smiled without mockery. "Security and space," he said, and tapped a clipboard. "Do you have warm clothing?" a medic asked, and a man answered with a scraping laugh. "We had winter coats once," he said, and the medic offered a blanket. "Will we work?" someone demanded, and the sergeant replied, Yes, we will be asked to contribute to harvests and to repair trains. Are we prisoners? Another asked quietly, and the medic looked away for a second, then answered. You are in custody and you will have shelter and medical care. Medical care, repeated the first man, as if testing a new word. Even inoculations, the medic added, and the men exchanged looks. Can we write home? A younger prisoner asked, and the sergeant nodded. Letters are allowed, subject to inspection, he said, and tapped the papers again. Will they feed our families? Someone said desperately, and no one answered that question. There was only the clocking of names. The dialogue petered out into chewing and the sound of spoons against cans and the soft slap of a blanket being unfolded. The first technical description that stunned many of the prisoners was the efficiency of the Liberty shipyards. A concise explanation helps to understand the scale. Ship construction in American yards relied on prefabricated sections produced in separate shops and then welded together on slipways. Each Liberty ship took shape as modules were hoisted by electric cranes aligned to templates, which allowed parallel assembly lines. Workers specialized in riveting, welding, and fitting moved like parts of a machine themselves, reducing build times from months to weeks. The visual order, the rhythm of cranes, and the presence of women in the assembly lines constituted a literal demonstration of mass production. When the convoy of transports reached Norfolk, the scene changed from tents to a city that smelled of salt and oil and hot metal. The harbor was a forest of masts, scaffolds, and half-finished hulls. Men watched as a young woman operated a crane with a steady wrist and a face made stubborn by practice. The magnitude was not only in numbers, but in scale. Reports later recorded tonnages and outputs with clinical precision. Norfolk produced thousands of tons of equipment each month and shipped them in convoys to distant fronts. For prisoners who had lived with the idea that American democracy could not combine industry and care, the sight of docks humming through the night with lights and activity was dissonant. The arrival involved running conversations between officers, dock workers, and prisoners. An interpreter named Anna Schultz stood between languages as a mediator. Where will they go from here? Captain Robert Lang asked the civilian foreman, and the foreman gestured toward the rails. Trains are ready, he said, and spat into the dirt. They will go upstate, Lang replied, as if cataloging the answer. Do they cooperate with work? A dock worker said and shrugged. Some do not, Anna said, and a prisoner near the gangplank laughed and then stopped as if laughing was a borrowed currency. Can they see the city? A young private asked, and the foreman folded his hands. Only supervised routes, he said, and an older prisoner clucked. Supervised or shown, he said, and adjusted his cap. What are those ships called? A man asked, pointing, and a dock worker said, Liberty ships, and the word traveled through the ranks like a new name for something immense. They build many, Anna added, and the prisoner repeated the name slowly like a charm. The train journey inland was a steady unspooling of contradiction. Pullman cars smelled of polish and faint perfume. Electric lamps cast warm pools of light on upholstery worn but soft. Outside the window, towns flashed by, each with glowing signs, store windows, and factories working in shifts. Men who had been told that American society was broken began to catalog small anomalies. A bakery open late, a family carrying groceries, a municipal water tower with a fresh coat of paint. Dialogues in the cars multiplied as the day stretched. Look at those lights, Friedrich Wagner whispered and tapped the glass. So many bulbs, Carl answered and rubbed his jaw. Do they have electricity everywhere? Asked a man who had been a farmhand. It seems so, someone replied. If everyone had light, why would they fight? The farmhand said slowly. This is propaganda, another snapped reflexively, and then the farmhand looked at his jacket as if measuring the strength of an old belief. We were told their cities are primitive, the first replied, and a veteran beside him laughed hollowly. Primitive with assembly lines, he said, and the laugh had no joy. Do they have bread like that in towns? Asked a younger man as he passed a bakery where loaves were stacked in windows. "Bread with butter," someone said, and the younger man closed his eyes and imagined. "Will we be allowed to work at times?" a sergeant asked, and the guard responded, "You will be offered tasks and paid rations," and the sergeant sighed as if the idea of payment introduced a new moral calculus. Each important scene in this journey included a constellation of sensory impressions. The Pullman carriage offered the smell of polished wood, the sound of wheels on track, a faint metallic tang from lamps, the taste of coffee, and the tactile smoothness of velvet cushions. The station platforms provided the noisy clatter of baggage, the smell of coal dust, the visual rhythm of semaphore arms, and the tactile jolt of stepping from a moving vehicle to a stable platform. These details accumulated to create a sense of a country that functioned, a country whose systems extended to its edges and whose rhythms were not solely martial. Camps were arranged inland in areas with space and agricultural potential. Barracks were wooden structures with high windows and efficient heating systems. The regimen of daily life balanced food hygiene, medical care, and assigned tasks. Hospitals within the camp areas had real facilities and stocked medicines, including penicillin, that was administered to many with swift success. For men who had been told that enemy nations would deny care to others, the sight of a German soldier being treated without malice was deeply disorienting. Names like Nurse Evelyn Shaw, Dr. Samuel Price, and Professor Eleanor Grant appear in records as people who treated prisoners with professional detachment and often with personal kindness. The barracks smelled of pine and soap. The mess halls served hot stew, fresh vegetables, and occasionally cake. The ration tables were organized by batch and stamped menus documented caloric content and nutrient composition. The daily routine produced a flattened anxiety. Men found time to write letters to families and to read newspapers provided by charitable groups. Several secondary characters exerted influence in community life. Maria Lopez oversaw a kitchen serving civilian aid packages. Sergeant Thomas Reed coordinated work crews. Walter Klein organized a reading group that exchanged newspapers and debates. Anna Schultz taught basic correspondence classes. Captain Robert Lang oversaw medical supply chains. Each of these figures played a part in shaping the perception of prisoners. Work assignments were diverse. Some men worked on farms harvesting crops. Others repaired rail lines or assisted in factories with supervision. The technical descriptions of these assignments are important. A typical farm assignment included supervised operation of a combine, a multi-part machine that cut, threshed, and separated wheat by throughput. Instruction began with an overview of components, then with hands-on guidance on controlling speed, throat height, and safety features. Workers learned to adjust the feed mechanism to account for moisture and grain size and to monitor yield rates displayed on a simple console. Over weeks, small groups achieved measurable increases in output and were credited on local logs. The visibility of skilled labor and its rewards complicated narratives that had portrayed labor exclusively as exploitation. Dialogues during labor shifts were long and revealing. On a harvest crew, Carl and Hans traded banter with a foreman named Samuel, who guided them through the combine operation. "Keep the throttle there," Samuel said, and pointed to a lever with grease dark at the edge. "Like this," Carl answered, and gripped the metal. "You are steady," Samuel said approvingly. "Do you get paid?" Hans asked, and Samuel laughed. "You earn more rations and small wages," he said, and tapped a ledger. "Wages?" repeated Hans, as if testing a strange new currency. "If you hurt yourself, will they help?" Carl asked, and Samuel replied, "There is a hospital and penicillin available," and the two exchanged looks at the foreign word. "Penicillin," the younger man said, and smiled at the sound of it. "You will have clean water too," Samuel added, and Hans cupped his hands and drank from a hose as Samuel watched. "Can we write now?" someone else called, and a clerk passed envelopes and paper down the line. "Letters are censored," Samuel warned, but a grin slid across his face. "Still better than silence," he said, and the men returned to the rhythm of cutting and feeding, watching the machine swallow stalks and return straw in a neat pile. Moments of tension occurred when the past intruded on the present. One such moment arrived when a convoy of American citizens visited the camp to donate knitted garments and toys. Some prisoners watched from a distance while others were invited to a communal meal. An old argument flared between a prisoner who insisted the generosity was manipulation and a younger soldier who had already begun to accept small kindnesses as evidence of a different world. The debate ran deep into memory and ideology. The scene developed into a palpable choice between clinging to taught certainties and acknowledging new evidence. One moment of tension focused on a night when news of a major battle arrived by radio in a mess hall. Men clustered around a single transistor, and the voice announced losses, gains, and strategic shifts. For some, the news confirmed defeat, and for others it reinforced a need to hold to doctrine. Memory pressed in on both sides. A veteran remembered his father teaching him an old proverb that valor must be defended at all costs. A young man thought of his mother sending parcels before capture. They argued in low voices about honor and survival, and whether cooperation might mean complicity. The tension peaked when a fight threatened to break out and then subsided as the camp commander intervened, offering hot soup and an open letter from the Red Cross explaining the terms of prisoner treatment. The fight subsided, but the internal conflict persisted as men lay awake considering whether their future would be built on resistance or on adaptation. Re-education programs formed part of the strategy to manage prisoners and to offer alternatives to extremist ideology. Courses in English literacy, civics, and technical skills were offered often through correspondence arrangements with universities and civic groups. A technical description clarifies the correspondence model. Prisoners enrolled by filling a form listing prior education and desired courses. Materials were sent via military mail from partnering universities and included textbooks, audio recordings, and assignments. A local instructor collected completed work and forwarded it for grading and return. Credits were issued and in some cases certificates awarded. The program was designed to be voluntary yet appealing and to provide tangible proof that study and productivity could yield social mobility. Many men signed up not because they rejected old beliefs, but because curiosity clashed with the monotony of camp life. Events of human kindness deepened the cracks in ideological armor. At Christmas, a shipment of packages arrived from community groups containing chocolate, coffee, nuts, and small toys. The smell of chocolate in a cold barrack was a sensory shock. A violinist from a nearby town performed in a chapel tent, and the music unsettled men who had been taught to see cultural exchange as contamination. Particular stories circulated. Walter Klein met Maria Lopez when she handed him a tin of canned peaches, and he wrote later that the fruit tasted like betrayal and mercy at once. An Italian unit that had been interned earlier in the war joined in cooperative tasks and shared songs that introduced language and rhythm that new prisoners found unexpectedly warm. Small human gestures performed the same work as evidence and numbers. They suggested that ordinary people could be generous without strategic calculation. The climax began with news of large-scale operations in Europe and with the fact that many prisoners would eventually be repatriated. Reports of D-Day and subsequent advances reached camps in waves, and with the knowledge came an uncertain relief. The liberty to choose where to send future letters to be read by many and the possibility of migration opened new questions. For some men, the accumulation of experiences produced a decisive cognitive change. A number began to write home, not to boast of conquest, but to describe factories, libraries, and the reliable tap in barracks. Others clung to the old world. The transformation was not uniform, but measurable. Records show that by late 1945, more than 400,000 German POWs had been held in the United States, with thousands participating in educational programs and many employed in agriculture and industry that returned measurable yields to local economies. Individuals emerged from the camps carrying new skills and new ambiguities. The liberation and the return to Europe were both an end and a beginning. Men who had seen power and production found it difficult to reconcile that knowledge with the ruins they encountered at home. Some returned as reformers, bringing ideas of cooperative industry and modern agricultural techniques. Others returned embittered by displacement and loss. The final chapters of this story examine outcomes through statistical evidence and personal testimony. Data from military archives indicate the number of work hours contributed crop yields increased and numbers of correspondence courses completed. Personal records show the long-term impact on civic participation and political attitudes among former prisoners who later took roles in Reconstruction. Epilogue, 1 month later. 1 month after the first transfers began, many of the men were still processing what their eyes had registered. A letter from Hans to a cousin described with precise detail the smell of the docks and the cadence of the assembly lines, and suggested that industry and decency could coexist. In local economies, the presence of prisoner labor had raised harvested yields and reduced spoilage by a measured margin. Socially, volunteers who had visited received as much from their encounters as the men who received packages. In a small town, a library recorded a surge in interest in technical manuals. The immediate effect was a series of quiet conversations in German homes, where the phrase electric light became a new reference point. Families debated whether the world they had been taught to call decadent might contain models worth studying for bitter, pragmatic reasons. The 1 month mark revealed that shock had settled into curiosity, and that curiosity could harden into action or retreat. Epilogue, 3 months later. At 3 months, the flow of information and the accumulation of changes had produced clearer patterns. Educational programs reported completion rates, and the archives show certificates issued for courses in mechanics, agriculture, and basic engineering. Some men had already begun to plan post-war livelihoods that incorporated skills learned in American camps. Politically, local leaders noted variations in attitudes among returnees, with a minority joining Reconstruction movements that advocated for modernization rather than restoration. Personal stories multiplied. Carl found that small technical training had made him valuable to a cooperative seeking to mechanize harvest in his region. He wrote of the smell of oil on his hands and of the hum of a combine as a new rhythm. The social implications reached beyond individuals. Agricultural boards recorded yield increases where returned workers applied new techniques. The 3 month mark made evident that exposure to functioning institutions could alter trajectories for communities, not just for isolated men. Epilogue, 6 months later. 6 months after initial contact, the longer-term reverberations were visible in institutions and in memory. Several former prisoners had enrolled in universities through continuing correspondence programs, and a handful had emigrated under post-war labor agreements, carrying the technical know-how they had acquired. Local factories found that a number of returnees who had worked on assembly lines abroad introduced minor process improvements that raised throughput. Statistically, the combined effect on regional output was modest but symbolically significant. On a cultural level, the diaries and letters amassed in archives formed a counter-narrative to wartime propaganda, showing nuance, complexity, and the slow penetration of lived experience into belief systems. The 6 month mark, a pattern emerged. Where men had been given access to education, housing, healthcare, and meaningful work, the chance of ideological transformation rose measurably. Where such provisions were absent, old narratives persisted. The historical lesson is not that industrial abundance alone reshaped minds, but that sustained exposure to institutions that function with competence, transparency, and a degree of humanity made doubt contagious in productive ways. The moral that threads through these episodes is both narrow and broad. Narrow because it tells of individuals who saw that electricity and production could be organized in a manner that supported life rather than merely signaled power. Broad because it suggests a mechanism by which societies can undercut dangerous ideologies not by rhetoric alone, but by demonstrating alternatives through lived experience. In the documents and voices gathered here, there is consistent evidence that meals, libraries, hospitals, and steady work were not neutral amenities, but powerful pedagogic tools. The final statistics underline the scope and limits of that pedagogy. Hundreds of thousands of men passed through American camps, thousands completed courses, and many returned with altered expectations. The implication for policy and for memory is clear. When institutions deliver on basic human needs and when they permit learning and participation, they create openings for change that propaganda cannot achieve on its own. If this account made you reconsider how ordinary infrastructure can be an agent of persuasion, consider subscribing to follow this series of document-based stories. We explore how practical systems shape beliefs and how gestures of routine care sometimes speak more loudly than manifestos. If you were struck by a single detail, tell us which one with a single word: food, light, or kindness. Your single word helps choose which documents and interviews we examine next. They arrived believing scarcity was a sign of virtue and left holding newly fragile convictions. The archives show numbers, and the personal notes reveal doubt. The lasting image is simple and stubborn: a lit lamp, a hot meal, a stamped letter that together made it harder to return to a brittle certainty. In the end, the evidence suggests that a nation that builds not only ships and factories, but also systems of care, can alter hearts in small, steady measures. That is the lesson these files keep insisting upon.